Excellencies, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen, our next panel is entitled Building a Resilient Economy Post-Pandemic. Let us warmly invite our panelists and moderator to the floor. Dr. Aladdin D. Rillo, Senior Economic Advisor at Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Mr. Desmond Kuek, Divisional Vice-Chairman of UBS Global Wealth Management. Ms. Gong Ying, Founder, Chairwoman, and Chief Executive Officer of EVYD. Mr. Lim Cho Kiat, Chief Executive Officer of GIC Private Limited, Singapore. Dr. Diame Diop, Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand at the World Bank. Mr. Toshinori Doi, Director of ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office. Our moderator for this panel is Ms. Rachel Kelly, Senior Producer and Presenter of Money FM 89.3 Singapore. Ms. Kelly, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, distinguished guests, conference participants, and attendees. As mentioned, I'm Rachel Kelly. I'm with Money FM 89.3, where I host a primetime show which focuses on issues such as regional economic growth, trending news topics, as well as sustainability and finance. Now, it's an absolute honor to be here with all of you today. And so far, we've listened to conversations surrounding the science behind the pandemic, lessons learned from managing the COVID-19 pandemic in ASEAN, and the role of research in public health. Now we're going to talk about building a resilient economy post-pandemic. And I think resilience is really the key word here. If there's something that we've all gained over the past 2 years, I think you'll all agree that it is resilience. But individual resilience is one thing. How can we build a more resilient economy after the pandemic? And how do we strike a balance between protecting people's economic livelihoods and their health? So these are some of the issues that we're going to discuss during the panel session today. And I know that the names of the panelists have already been read out, but I'd like to share a little bit more background with you since we have such an esteemed group of panelists with us today. So of course we have Mr. Lim Cho Kiat, CEO, GIC Singapore. Mr. Lim is responsible for the overall performance and capabilities of the firm. In particular, he drives and oversees GIC's long-term investment and organizational strategy. Ms. Gong Ying, the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer, Chairwoman and Founder of EDUTech, which is a leading medical big data and artificial intelligence company based in China. Mr. Toshinori Doi, Director, ASEAN Plus 3 Macroeconomic Research Office. Mr. Doi also has a long track record in macroeconomic policy making and international finance. And previously, Mr. Doi was Special Advisor to the Ministry of Finance of Japan and Deputy to Deputy Finance Minister. Mr. Diame Diop, Dr. Diame Diop is the World Bank Country Director for the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and Brunei. He engages with government counterparts and in-country stakeholders and provides strategic direction to the World Bank programs in these countries. Dr. Aladdin D. Rillo is currently a senior economic advisor for the Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. And prior to that, he worked at the ASEAN Secretariat for many years, where he served in various positions. And last but not least, of course, Mr. Desmond Kuek, Divisional Vice-Chairman, Head of Sustainable Finance APAC, and Global Head of UBS Group Sustainable Finance Committee. Panelists, thank you all for joining us today. So first, to start off this session, let's set the scene. In the last session, they were talking about the development of vaccines, and we've seen vaccines deployed globally, yet we continue to see fresh waves of the virus. Large and small businesses have been squeezed. Economies across the globe have come under immense pressure. And the term new normal now, though, is thrown around on a daily basis. Across the region, though, we're starting to see regional economies treat the coronavirus as endemic. But a question to all of you, if you could just give a quick answer, are we there yet? Or is a mindset shift still needed to build resilient economies post-pandemic? Mr. Lim, perhaps I can start with you.
Right, Rachel. Well, first I would say great to be here to join everybody to talk about this very important topic of building resilience in ASEAN economy. I think very quickly responding to your question, Desmond and I were just having a chat just now about the importance of this mindset change of, in a way, getting into a hybrid mode. Right, we're just talking about how an event like this is possible today, partly because of our experience over the last 2 years. Previously, it would be a lot harder to get a big group of people to come together in a hybrid format. So I think that speaks to an aspect of resilience, mindset change, as well as having, you might say, multi-modes of operation. Thank you.
Mr. Kuek, then do you agree?
Well, totally. And also good afternoon to everybody. Pleasure to be with you. As Chalkit said, we're moving in this new normal from more physical, perhaps, to more digital. We're finding a shift, perhaps, if you like, from what we used to think about more global to making sure that we have resilience in a local and a more regional setting, where we used to think about fixed. We're now wanting to be a lot more agile. And I think all of this is the kind of new normal that we're already seeing today. And the COVID situation as it plays out may yet see a further acceleration of some of these trends. But I would say from where I'm sitting, that the silver lining perhaps is that there appears to be this race towards net zero. And with that comes exciting opportunities for all of us.
Mr. Doi, what are your thoughts? I know you've been tracking the region's economic trajectory.
Thank you, Rachel. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting us to this very timely and important conference. And as you say, the COVID-19 virus with the new Delta variant has proven to be very tenacious than we expected. A few months ago, I think everybody expected that with the high rate of vaccination, we'll get herd immunity, which will enable us to open up our economy. But the recent developments in some of the highly vaccinated countries suggest that things may not be that simple. The situation is still quite fluid, and we still don't quite know what the new normal is going to look like. And in Asia, some countries are still pursuing the zero COVID strategy, but it now looks as if for the majority of the countries in the region, until we can come up with some new treatment or a new cure, we don't have much option but to learn to live, to coexist with the virus by making our society more resilient, more stronger to the occasional surge and the infection.
Thank you. Dr. Rillo, are we ready to open up and treat the virus as endemic?
I think, thank you so much, Rachel, and good afternoon. The question of whether we are now in a new normal, for me, the answer is yes. If you look at COVID-19, it has actually the change around us or changed the world around us in so many ways. And most of these changes are considered to be transformative. For example, digitalization, which I expect to continue to accelerate even beyond this pandemic. And some changes may not continue at all. It may not be permanent. For example, remote working or even online learning. But in my view, regardless of the changes that we're seeing right now, I think the new normal presents a new window of opportunity to shape the future, and at the same time to better understand what are the new challenges that we seem to have taken for granted for a while. For example, before COVID, nobody imagined that the supply chains will become disrupted, right? Also, no one imagined that technologies can be so powerful in terms of their impacts. And at the same time, nobody had imagined the linkage between climate change and health issues. For me, these are important issues that we need to contend with in the coming years. And I think the new normal provides us the opportunity to address these issues head on and to be able to better understand what the future lies ahead and how to overcome all these challenges. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Diop, as somebody who provides strategic direction to the World Bank programs in the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, and Brunei, what are your thoughts on where we are at the moment in terms of recovery from the pandemic?
Thank you very much, Rachel. First of all, allow me to thank the organizers for inviting us. We are very, very pleased and honored to be here. I would agree with what my fellow panelists have said. It is unfortunately becoming clear that COVID-19 is unlikely to disappear in the foreseeable future. We therefore need to start seeing it as an endemic and learn to live with it. Now, things are very fluid, but a few empirical observations are emerging from countries with high vaccination rates, such as Germany, Israel, and United Kingdom. Number one, vaccination is positively correlated with economic growth. Number two, vaccination is negatively correlated with serious illness and mortality. But number three, even at 60% vaccination rate, that does not eliminate infection. So it logically follows from these empirical facts that accelerating vaccination could help countries in ASEAN and elsewhere transition to a relatively benign phase of COVID-19. And across East Asia, vaccination rates are picking up, and most countries in this region could reach 60% of vaccination coverage by the first half of next year. Now, there is another set of numbers that are less inspiring, unfortunately, and these relate to the cost of COVID restrictions in terms of non-COVID disease and deaths, jobs, income, literacy, and education. And in many countries, COVID restrictions are increasing mortality because of a rise in non-COVID diseases and mental health issues. Now, if you combine the positive effect of vaccination and the cost of COVID restriction, one may consider that allowing a resumption of economic activities is something that government should do without hesitation. Unfortunately, it's not that simple because there are psychological factors that are almost as important as the hard numbers when it comes to COVID-19. And the psychology of the virus is very complex. In almost every country, it is very hard to build consensus around reopening economies because of the wide spectrum of opinion and level of comfort for reopening. So I think while we can see a clear rationale for reopening economies and living with the virus, in the months to come, decision makers will probably need to find ways to reassure their population and strengthen confidence that once the economy is reopened, the risk of serious illness and mortality will be maintained at low level.
Thank you, Dr. Diop. That is a difficult question indeed, balancing economic growth and the health of the population as well. Ms. Gong, you offer an interesting perspective as Edu Tech is a leading medical big data and artificial intelligence company based in China. You've been at the forefront of the pandemic. What are some of the shifts that you've seen, and where do you think we are at the moment in tackling the virus and on the recovery path?
Thank you, Rachel, for that interesting question. And I'm going to keep my answer very short because I totally agree with a few remarks that was made by the previous speakers. The COVID-19 pandemic is a really, really profound reminder of how fragile the current social functioning and the public health systems are. I think we do really need to adjust our mindset accordingly. And our approach to response to risks like this, the more timely risks can be identified and eliminated, the less pressure there will be to restore economic and social order. So embrace technology, enhance our predictability to public health risks. And I hope with the technology that we can have a happier and a healthier new normal.
That's a lovely positive note to end that first round of questions on. So, Dr. Rillo, I just want to go back to a point that you made in terms of regional growth. I mean, we've seen a number of downgrades of ASEAN's economic outlook, but what's your perspective? What's your outlook?
I think in terms of outlook, I'm sure everybody here agrees that COVID-19 remains a significant risk to the region. But I think the risk now is more balanced compared to where we are last year. While economic recovery, in my view, is now underway, the health crisis is still very much a threat, is still very much around, and there is definitely a huge uncertainty surrounding this outlook. In fact, output and growth momentum in most ASEAN countries, perhaps with the exception of Vietnam, are expected to remain below the pre-pandemic levels this year. And we expect only the recovery to come in force by next year. Nonetheless, I think it is important to highlight here that any prospect of recovery in the region will depend so much again on the availability of vaccines, as what our other panelists have mentioned, and also to what extent strong medical interventions as well as containment measures are implemented by countries in the region. In my view, to be able to deliver sizable output gains in the medium term and to also offset the economic scarring from this pandemic or from this crisis, regional policy coordination is indeed critical. But I think the more important challenge here, the way I see it, is how countries in the region, how the region in general, is able to lay the foundation for a resilient and inclusive recovery. And in my view, there are two important aspects that I think would affect the future recovery in the region moving forward. One important aspect is the ability of the region to build more resilient and smarter supply chains. I think this is very important because if you look at ASEAN, our growth over the years is very much underpinned by supply chain connectivity and regional production networks. Therefore, as the post-pandemic recovery starts to emerge, I think the need to strengthen supply chain connectivity, in my view, is no longer an option, but rather it is an imperative for a more sustainable future. And when we talk about supply chain resilience, I think there are different ways of enhancing resilience. I think one possible way, and I think this is very much discussed during this pandemic, is the need to scale up digitalization. I think digitalization will help enhance the visibility in each stage of the supply chain. And that is important in order to enhance the capacity of countries to deal with future shocks, and as well as to mitigate the impacts of these shocks. And that's why I think it is important that countries in the region continue to prioritize how they can intensify the use of technological solutions to support the supply chains. For example, how to strengthen e-commerce, how to promote digital investment, and so forth. But I think a more other important issue, and this is the second point like to highlight, is the ability of the COVID-19 has actually
Dr. Rillo, you're breaking up a little bit.
Reduction globally.
Dr. Rillo, you're breaking up. Your connection's breaking up a little bit. And I think you've mentioned some key points there, such as smarter supply chains. But I just want to go back to a point that Dr. Diop mentioned earlier on as well, and that was about the cost of opening and the impact the pandemic is expected to have on poverty and also inequality. This was also highlighted in a recent paper that you published, Dr. Diop. Before we go into some of the opportunities and we look at supply chain, we look at sustainability, we look at digitalization, I would just want to take a step back and look at how the pandemic perhaps has looked at different areas of inequality within regional economies and what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Yes, indeed, COVID-19 has inflicted many pains. It has also brought opportunities, such as the rise of digital adoption and use, as was mentioned earlier. Now, the problem is that the distribution of pains and the distribution of opportunities are both tilted against the poor. The poor and the smaller firms are most hardly hit by COVID-19, and they are also the least equipped to cope with it and to capture any opportunity brought by COVID-19. And this is why we are saying that inequality is likely to increase in many countries. Now, our most recent regional economic update looked at the scars left by COVID-19 in many countries. And COVID has been and is a very big hit to household income, health and nutrition, literacy and education. And some of these effects may be long-lasting, if not quickly corrected. For example, food insecurity increases the risk of stunting, which impedes children's development and earnings as adults. And limited engagement in online learning could cost the average student in school today a reduction of 3.8% in expected earnings every year. So these are really large costs that will certainly pressure inequality or increase inequality. Now, what to do with it? How to address this? First, using the available fiscal space more effectively. After 2 years of supporting the economy, most governments really are seeing their fiscal space eroded. And the challenge going forward will be less available financing for a pandemic that is not ending. So it is important to be very effective in public spending, for example, improving public investment management to reduce the efficiency gaps, reducing the loopholes in the tax system, perhaps using digital transformation, etc. Second, taking a hard look at the medium-term expenditure plans, especially in areas like health, education, and infrastructure, to inject the sort of, or reflect the fact that this virus is staying here for longer. And this is important also to correct or to catch up or to make up for the 2 years of negative impact in education and health, for example. And thirdly, for example, in the health sector, I think it will be important to look at the intra-sectoral reallocation of resources within that sector itself, because COVID is a new element. It's taking resources, and it will be important to, I think, look at how spending in health in the next few years, in the medium term, should be calibrated to the new reality of today. Another key policy is really to improve social protection, and in particular, the delivery system. Using digital tools, national IDs, payment system, we've seen evidence of countries that have those three elements, that they are much faster and much more efficient and effective in delivering support to the population that need it. And then finally, helping the firms adopt digital tools will be really important, because this is key for resilience and business continuity. Let me stop here.
Thank you. Mr. Doi, what are your thoughts on that? Dr. Diop mentioned there boosting healthcare spending. And the question that I have for you is, how can we strike a balance between economic growth and population health? And also your outlook for the region. I know that you've got an update coming soon. In a recent paper, you also published that the uncertainty and challenges ahead require vision, commitment, and coordinated action in our region.
Thank you, Rachel. I think that safeguarding public health has been and continues to be the top priority in the region. So until a new treatment is found, I think a collective aim should be to emerge from the pandemic through vaccination and not through infections. So there are still a lot of things that we do not know about this virus. So we need to be flexible and patient when we try to organize the full reopening of our economy. With the resurgence of the virus, we have seen that many countries in the region had to push back their plan for reopening of the economy. And as you mentioned in the Regional Economic Outlook report that we will issue tomorrow, unfortunately, we had to revise down the growth forecast for the many countries in the region. Anybody who is interested in the report, I suggest you take a look, go visit our website and take a look. I mean, revised down meaning compared to our growth projection that we did in March. So when it comes to reopening, I think there's no one-size-fits-all approach. We have to take into account such things as rate of vaccination, the strength of the healthcare system, the prevailing condition of the economy, and also the remaining policy space available for each country. So in order to think about how to reopen, I think all those elements will come into play, and it will have to be calibrated to each country-specific circumstances. And it's also important to keep in mind that any policy shift will have to be gradual and also well communicated so that we don't want any surprises. We don't want any unwanted side effects coming from the policy changes. And we also have to be aware that given the interconnectedness of the region, there are spillover effects of various containment measures and border restrictions of an individual country to the rest of the region. And we have seen that in the disruption through supply chains and also flow of migrant workers. And this region is at the heart of global supply chain network, and it has to. I mean, we have to make sure that it stays that way. And so it's very important that countries in the region collaborate to make sure that we can deal with any disruptions or emerging issues coming from future crisis situation. And for example, in the ASEAN +3 region, the member countries, the countries in the region worked hard to make sure that the resilience of financial soundness or financial stability will be increased after the Asian financial crisis back in 1997. And so now we have the world's second largest regional financial safety net, which we call Chiang Mai Initiative Multilateralization, or CMIM. And we all know that after that, we haven't had any regional financial crisis. So countries in the region were able to emerge out of this Asian crisis, even stronger. So if we can find a way to collaborate, make this region more resilient against any future shocks coming from such spread of virus, I think we can emerge from the pandemic even stronger as compared to the past. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Doi. And speaking of emerging stronger, while your upgrade may be less than rosy in the short to medium term, and there are challenges ahead, there are also opportunities. Mr. Lim, from an investment perspective, what are some of those opportunities? ASEAN ministers have agreed to start talks on the Digital Economy Framework Agreement by 2025. Digital, one of the key ones?
Yeah, Rachel, I guess first is important to state, right? The primary function of investing is to bridge savings with business needs. I think investors indeed would like to find places where there are good investment or business needs. And ASEAN, actually as a region, has many long-term fundamentals going for it. So in terms of opportunities, perhaps we can think about it in sort of two buckets. The first is in the physical side of things. I think earlier Desmond touched a bit on sustainability, type of opportunities. I think that's a big area. It's quite clear that this region of 600 over million people need to transition in the energy space. And I would expect, a lot of opportunities will come through in that space, right, of finding sort of greener solutions. Related to that, even if you think in terms of the physical aspect of it, the e-commerce part of it in terms of logistics, there is still a lot of gap that I think investors can find opportunities to deploy capital. So these are some examples of the physical side. On the digital side, even more plentiful. I think a few of the fellow panelists have touched on some aspect of it. You can see that of course, in retail, in e-commerce, kind of related investment in finance, fintech, right? I mean, there are a lot of unbanked, people in the region, at least 50% of the population. So that's a big one, right? Because fintech allows you to get banking services delivered at a very low cost. So you can actually launch a lot of mass financial services products. So that's another one. Healthcare, right? That's big in terms of telemedicine, in terms of, I think, sharing of data, doing research, finding solutions. And as earlier panelists talked about, the pressure on fiscal resources, this kind of digitalization and using higher tech, to deal with this issue, I think can go in a big way, right, to save government a lot of money. So I think from an investor point of view, there are many needs in the society, in the various economies, which could offer those kind of investment opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Lim. Mr. Kuek, just following on from those points, in your role as Head of Sustainable Finance APAC and Global Head of UBS Group Sustainable Finance Committee, what's your perspective on the role that sustainable finance plays in building the regional recovery post-pandemic?
Oh, we think the future in the region is likely to be centered around growth in the digital space and the sustainable space. And I think these two actually go quite well hand in hand. Frankly, our conversations with asset owners, with investors, with our private wealth clients have shown an increasing interest, if you like, in how to finance the transition to a low carbon economy, how to bring about growth in a sustainable and inclusive way, how to manage risk and improve the portfolio risk, if you like, looking into the future post-pandemic. And if you look at opportunities, and I think again, Chow Kiat mentioned, and another of the panelists mentioned that energy, just look at energy transition in Asia alone, there is huge potential for public and private investors, financiers to come together to see how to go about doing this for the region. And if you just look at the research from COP26, they already point to something in the region of $3.6 trillion that needs to go into sustainable infrastructure and perhaps funding annually the kind of innovation, the kind of reinvention of business so that we can be a lot more resilient into the future. And I see, therefore, our role really in the financial world is to provide, in a way, that ecosystem to bring the planet, people, and partnership ideas together. And here, of course, when we think about planet, we're talking about climate programs. We talk about people, obviously, we're talking about health and education. And as far as partnerships go, clearly in ASEAN, within our region, there are huge opportunities for us to partner across jurisdictions, public and private sector, to bring about the kind of connection of people, capital, ideas that makes for a much more resilient future that's also at the same time sustainable. And I think sustainable finance, therefore, coming in with the notion that you can create impact, as what they say, you know, you can do good as well as do well in your investments, is a very powerful idea that sits well with today's generation of millennials who are very much seized, rightly so, by the idea that we do need to create for ourselves a much more sustainable future. And if we can, of course, I'm not saying there are no challenges. There are a lot of challenges in this space of sustainability, not least in the way in which we capture data in a meaningful way, or we are able to ensure transparency and disclosure, or whether we've got the same language and taxonomy around sustainability. These are all challenges, but I do believe we can get there if we strengthen up the partnerships within the region and globally. And we definitely are optimistic that this is the right time for this to take place. And the pandemic has brought a lot of that urgency and timeliness in this together to show that this is something that we really can do and must do going forward.
Profits with purpose to power the recovery. I like that. Thank you very much. And following on from that, Ms. Gong, from your perspective, we've heard some conversations there surrounding digital, surrounding big data, surrounding AI going forward. How has the pandemic reshaped, or will it reshape, do you think, the medical AI sector, and what does this mean for the region?
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I mainly see the pandemic has done two things. First, it has changed our way of living and working. It has increased people's willingness to embrace new tools and technology, getting people to focus on conversations like data security, accessibility, and getting policymakers to set new policies to guide this new industry for a new sustainable future. Secondly, the pandemic boosted people's confidence of potential AI technology. This is based on our experience and conversation with our partners and customers. So I hope that the infrastructure that's been developed for the pandemic responses can lay a strong foundation for the population health management, which I hope should lead a valuable based precision healthcare system in the future, thus for the region.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of time. You know that we've just got so much to cover and we've got 10 minutes left. I'm going to open up to some Q&A before we round up on perhaps some of the key points that will make a resilient or build a resilient economy post-pandemic. Perhaps we can bring up the first question. Here we are. Okay. So the first question, this is for Ms. Gong. It says, leveraging on your strong clinical database, EduTech is growing in China and Edu is penetrating into Singapore and Brunei markets. Do you think your database, which is mainly consisted of Chinese clinical data, can help tackle COVID-19 in Southeast Asia?
I hope so. Probably in the future, within the guidelines of compliance and data security. And I think that, you know, we have done a lot of research on different diseases and includes COVID and other diseases in China. And hopefully that with our development in the region, in Brunei, in Singapore, and in many other countries, that we work with the local authorities and the scientists in the region, that we can bring the researcher worlds together.
Thank you. There's a question here for me, Mr. Diop, as well. It says, you mentioned resource allocation. How can governments and organizations choose which resources to prioritize to promote economic growth while protecting health?
Yes, that's a very good question. And I think it's a question ministers of finance, secretaries of finance are pondering on every day these days. My sense is that going forward, it will be really important to prioritize some spending, such as health, vaccination, because these are prerequisites for recovery. Now, I think as the recovery gains traction, I think the onus, I think much opportunities would be for the private sector to take the relay of the government, because government cannot continue supporting the economy forever. Fiscal deficits are reaching very high levels. The level of public debts are increasing at very high level. At some point, government will have to unwind fiscal supports. But then it's really important to think about the timing very carefully and to do what it takes today to support the private sector, so that when the government unwinds fiscally, the private sector could take the relay and invest and grow the economy. So I think it's really, really important to coordinate today policies needed to improve the business environment, to improve the investment climate, opening up some sectors for investment, improving competition, and so on, facilitating business deployment in all sectors, because that will be really critical going forward as monetary policy and fiscal policy unwind in the future. Now, there is one element that is really important, which is international coordination of monetary and fiscal policies. One potential risk that we see is for the sort of more advanced economies to recover first or faster, and therefore embark in tightening faster. And that could, unfortunately, precipitate the untightening or the unwinding in countries in ASEAN, for example. So that's why I think, and I hope, that some discussion at the G20 will happen to really take into account the impact of the US, for example, Fed, tightening on countries in this region.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Great. I'm very mindful of time. We've got 2.5 minutes left and a lot of questions from the audience. But there's one that I want to highlight and perhaps end the session with, and that is, hold on 1 minute. Can we move to, there's another question above this one. Okay, so the question that I would like to address is, how can we measure resilience economically post-COVID-19? And perhaps I can ask each of the panelists to share with us their thoughts or 3 possible factors that they think, or the characteristics, what the characteristics are of a resilient economy. Perhaps Mr. Lim, you'd like to start.
Yeah, resilience. That certainly, is a very important sort of goal, right, to achieve, given a world that is full of so many uncertainties and risks. Fundamentally, right, resilience would have a few characteristics. One of which is, I think, one of our earlier panelists has touched on, right, buffer, right? How do you build buffers such that if you get a knock, even a body blow, you have the cushion, right, to to be able to recover from there on. So buffer building, I think through many of the measures which I think our fellow panelists talked about, I think will be very, very important. The second is diversification. Concentration just brings higher risks, right? If an economy is only dependent on a particular one or two drivers or sectors, it just makes it a lot harder. If right, one or two of those sectors get a significant slowdown. If I might say, if we sort of plug ourselves into the wider region, that might be a way for us to diversify, right? That you can leverage on sort of the neighboring economies as part of that effort to build resilience. In fact, supply chain resilience building net benefits this region because a lot of countries or multinationals are looking to sort of have multiple suppliers, and this region could well be, you know, an important sort of provider of that. And the last I would say would be in terms of sort of, you know, earlier mentioned as well, coordination, because a lot of these risks, whether it is the pandemic or, you know, the Fed policy, are sometimes, you know, outside of the control of a single country. So if there is some sort of international harmonization or coordination, I think that will also be helpful in this task.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Lim. And thank you again to all of our panelists. With that, we've come to the end of this session. To all of those attending, wishing you all an enjoyable rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.